As many points as I can on the global trends that are out there and how they are going to be impacting elections. I'm going to focus in 4 areas. Number one, elections themselves, which foreign policy, at least in the US, risks being a bigger issue than in most elections. So I'll discuss how that's going down. I'll talk about China, the China factor, which is interwoven into so many issues, including Gaza. Then the Global South, its increasing importance and its increasing estrangement from the West. And that estrangement is actually being increased by Gaza and Ukraine, as I will describe. And then finally, the global economy, because the de-risking and de-globalization that is going on now, partly because of the US-China competition, is highly inflationary. And inflation is a big issue in most countries now. Economic issues really are at the forefront. So that's basically what I'll try to cover. Ready to go? There it is. Okay. So, as a number of speakers have pointed out, we have an unprecedented number of elections going on this year. A lot of the important ones have already taken place. In a number of cases, we have had managed democracies at work. If you look at Russia, Boris Nadezhdin was an anti-war candidate, very popular among young Russians. He quickly got enough signatures to run, and of course he was disqualified on technical grounds. Same thing happened in Pakistan, when Imran Khan actually won the election, but he's in jail, unfortunately, and so we've had a number of elections that took place like that. Obviously, we've been talking a lot today about the EU election. It's going to be a measure of, yes, the far right, but not only the far right, because there are far left parties that are anti-EU as well. So we'll see on both sides of the spectrum how this plays out. And of course, the US election. Now, every year, the Council on Foreign Relations in New York comes up with its conflicts to watch in the coming year. And in red, you can see the ones that are the highest impact, most likely. And the number one threat this year, ahead of Gaza or Ukraine, is the US election. And this is echoed by the Eurasia group of the Ann Bremmer, who also puts the US election as the number one global threat, America against itself, as they say. Now, obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty that comes out from the US election, and that is worrying. But for CFR, at least, they're worried about the process of the election, the campaigns, and the possibility of violence, which exists. Obviously, the results, and will the other side contest the result, which is a real possibility. And then, of course, the implications of the election. So there's a lot of uncertainty, not least of all for Europe, because the two candidates obviously have very different approaches to European issues, potentially. Now, China. America is very polarized, and about the only thing that both parties can agree on in Washington today is China, and the need for a tougher line on China across the board. In America, and for that reason, China is interwoven into so much. In America, people now talk about the axis of adversaries, almost like George W. Bush's axis of evil. It is true that these 4 countries are cooperating more and more. We see it even in Ukraine. And so, for the United States, China is at the top of the agenda, and frankly, Europe and European issues are a subset of that. We talk about democracy versus autocracy as a framing device, but we're really looking at China in the midst of all that. Now, China is not 10 feet tall. Here's the UN's latest projection on population. As you can see, India is, as we speak, passing China as the most populous country in the world, but according to the UN, by the end of this century, lifetime of my students, China will go from 1.4 billion to 770 million. The Shanghai Statistics Office, just a couple of months ago, said, no, that's wrong, 525 million. Now, it's hard to imagine that kind of demographic change. China does not have the lowest birth rate. The lowest birth rate is South Korea, by far, 0.78, unprecedented. But populations are going down in parts of Asia and in Europe, as we all know. But the larger trend demographically is this. This is also from the UN. Africa, in relative terms, their birth rate might start to go down, but relative to the rest of the world, it will still be an increasing part of the human family, up to about 40% by the end of the century. And this brings us now to the importance of the global south. Asia, of course, the West, what we would call the West, G7, will be down to about 8% of the human population. Now, China and Russia are focusing on this like a laser. Ever since their February 4th, 2022 summit, they talk about the global majority, not the global south. And in their interaction with the global south, they will say, who are these 8% of the human population? All the former colonialists that plagued you all through your history, why would anyone listen to them? We are on your side, right? China has said recently, China will always be part of the global south. So, just demographically, this part of the world, and just most of the world, is coming up now. Africa today, 11 of the 20 fastest growing countries in the world today are in Africa. Now, obviously, they're starting from a lower point, but still, there's improvement there. So, here are two former national security advisors, Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, that older generation of the Cold War. And before he died a few months ago, Kissinger made a statement in which he said, looking ahead, we must always keep in mind we need active diplomacy with other nuclear powers in order to prevent the worst. Because you never let, in his view, a diplomacy lapse, as frankly is happening today. But Brzezinski was even more interesting. Having spent his whole career focused on Russia and Poland, his final article for the American Interest, he wrote, "A new historical narrative is emerging, a profound resentment against the West and its colonial legacy." I was very surprised to see this point echoed at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year. This is a meeting of NATO experts. It's a NATO-focused event every year. This is the one that Putin spoke to in 2007 and laid down the gauntlet. Every year, the Security Conference does a major report and a significant amount of polling to try to see where things are going. And this year, their conclusion was, this is a NATO organization, there's a revolt coming from the global south over the hypocrisy of the rules-based order. And here we see this in Gaza, but also Ukraine. A number of African leaders have pointed to what they call the racism of Ukraine, that Ukraine gets a lot of attention, say, in US media, whereas conflicts in the global south do not. And Cyril Ramaphosa, South Africa, is on record as saying, well, that's because Ukrainians are white. So there is this situation developing now. Interestingly, the Munich Security Conference also did a lot of polling among Europeans, and they found that there is a deep pessimism in the West over the economy, migration, and war. Of course, these are the issues we were talking about for the election. They concluded from their polling that the pessimism is deepest in Germany, that the pressures are building in Germany. This is a NATO survey. And then they pointed out that Russia and Ukraine are no longer, Russia rather, is no longer the top threat in most of the countries polled. It's fallen to number 7 in Germany, to number 12 in Italy, for example. This doesn't mean that people don't support Ukraine, but it means that relative to other issues, it is falling in importance. So this brings us to Ukraine. I think Putin's initial mistaken policy was to try to intimidate Ukraine and execute the regime change. Bring the troops right to Kiev, take out the regime, and bring in a new regime. That failed, obviously. And so now it's basically Russia seeking to reconstitute what Putin calls Novorossiya, that eastern Russian-speaking portion. They already have captured most of it. The question is now, what will they do about Kharkiv, where things are heating up, and especially about Odessa. That's going to be the real turning point. Now, it's very tough for the Ukrainians now. Russia now has 510,000 troops involved in the war, 50,000 around Kharkiv. And Ukraine has a couple of very serious problems. Not enough ammunition, and frankly, the West is not producing enough ammunition. The United States has not geared up for a war like this since the 50s. This is a war like World War II. We've been conducting wars from the air, mostly. And so this is a huge problem for the Ukrainians, which hopefully we'll address. But most important, Ukraine is running out of soldiers. They've taken really quite high losses. And the former head of defense, Zaluzhny, was on record saying that this cannot be a long war because Ukraine does not have the manpower. So the question is, what does the West do to support them in this very dire circumstance? Should we send NATO troops? Should individual NATO countries send troops? Now, even before Macron made his declaration about French troops, the Poles, already over a year ago, talked about sending their own troops. And Washington put it down right away, saying there will be no individual engagement of troops from NATO. This is a NATO operation. You have to stay within the reservation. I think that is still our position in Washington. And so the question is, will countries like France send in training personnel? The problem is, you have to have somebody to train. And Ukraine is running out of troops. That's a lot. Over 1 million young Ukrainians are in Western Europe right now, as we all know. So how can NATO help in this circumstance? And the answer is attack-cruise missiles. We are risking now using French, American, and British long-range missiles to strike into Ukraine. Now, in the first year of the war, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, was asked why we weren't doing that. And he said, because we don't want to start World War III. Well, since then, there's been more and more willingness to push the envelope, shall we say, on this. And so the U.S. position still is, we will give these weapons to Ukraine, but they should use them within Ukraine and Crimea. We do not want them to use these weapons against Russia itself. But the U.S. says, but it's up to the Ukrainians. It's their decision. So it's kind of having it both ways. So we'll see where this goes. Russia does have 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons. Some of them placed now in Belarus. So the question is, will this escalate? Because the West has to do something. We have to support Ukraine, in spite of these very serious structural problems. Now, Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, is somewhat more optimistic. He believes that that support for Putin and support for what Russia is doing is slowly eroding. And he says they can see that at the CIA because it's never, ever in history been easier to recruit Russian agents. I mean, in this article, he said they can almost advertise on YouTube and they get responses. So he takes that as a sign that things are shaking underneath in Russia. So NATO's done a great job. There's been a great success in alliance management, if we might call it that, and especially now with Finland and Sweden coming in, a much longer border with Russia. These are all very, very positive developments. And Jake Sullivan has said, I think this is the U.S. policy. He says, if Ronald Reagan's formula was peace through strength, Joe Biden's formula is peace through American and Allied strength. Right? So the allies are more important than ever. This is where a Trump victory might change things a bit. But he said something else that's interesting. He said, President Biden has talked often about and feels very strongly about connecting our allies in the Atlantic with our allies in the Pacific. And so that is a major thrust of U.S. policy now to try to bring NATO and countries of Japan and South Korea together. In a sense, what we're trying to do is mobilize the two peripheries of Eurasia in a structure looking at what's happening in Eurasia itself with China, Russia, Iran. So Europe is part of that larger strategy right now. Now on Ukraine, as I say, the alliance management has been great, but the diplomacy in the global south, not so much. Here's a map of who supports sanctions. And basically, it's pretty much just the West and G7. Most of the global south has demurred on actual support for Ukraine. Another aspect of Ukraine that is important, for the US at least, is the economic impact. So Janet Yellen, who's been the chief of sanctions, for Russia, she's more dangerous than an attacking missile. I mean, she's the real threat because she manages the sanctions. But she's admitting now that the use of sanctions has caused some countries now to try to pull away from the dollar. And she said the dollar has declined by 8% just in the past year. It used to be 71% of global holdings were in the dollar. Now it's down to 58%. She said that's natural. When people see the dollar being weaponized, they are taking other steps. But she says this is temporary, so we shouldn't worry about it. But there are things going on. For instance, within the BRICS structure, how realistic this is, but moving toward a gold-backed currency. This would be linked to commodities. It would be used as a clearing mechanism. You wouldn't be getting these out of the open market, but they're planning to institute this in Kazan in October among the BRICS countries. So Washington is watching this with a good deal of concern. As our national debt now is heading up toward 35 trillion, which also is not great for the dollar. So an aspect of our policy on sanctions is being affected by this. But even more, the BRICS are expanding. And this brings us into the Middle East. This is where these issues start to link up. The most recent expansion was late last year into 6 new countries, including, as you can see, countries in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE. The United States sees China, once again, China is interwoven into all these things, coming into the Middle East, striking a deal now with Saudi Arabia to use the yuan instead of dollars, for example. So this concern has led to a couple of things. A shift in Biden's policy. When he came in, Biden was very down on Saudi Arabia. He accused Mohammed bin Salman of being responsible for the Khashoggi assassination. He criticized Trump's policy of trying to bring Israel together with Arab countries. But once we saw China coming in, 180-degree shift in his policy to strongly supporting Israeli-Saudi reconciliation. And a new proposal to try to counter the Chinese infrastructure building, the Belt and Road in Eurasia. In blue there you can see the new India-Middle East corridor that we proposed before the October 7th event. And as you can see, Saudi Arabia is a very important part of it, and it comes out through Jordan and Israel. So stability in that area is very important. In pushing this, we did not talk about the Palestinian issue at all, right? We pretty much sidelined that. Biden has said now that the reason that Hamas attacked on October 7th was to stop this reconciliationist policy. And Hamas leadership has said the same thing, that is why they committed those atrocities, was to try to scuttle the reconciliation that Biden was pushing. So the Middle East, I mean, the chances of escalation are very great, unfortunately, depending on what happens in Rafah now. Our university campuses, including Minnesota, are affected by all these protests about what's happening there. What the Houthis are doing, once again, inflationary, adding to the routes for trade. 12% of global trade goes through the Red Sea, and it's all being diverted now. There's a very good chance that Israel eventually will attack in Lebanon to try to push Hezbollah north of the Litani River, if you see on the map there, maybe as far as Sidon. Because 80,000 or so Israelis have been displaced from northern Israel, and Israel feels that they have to do something about this. So there's a danger of escalation there as well, and of course with Iran and the various militias, there's constant tension, including the instability right now in the Iranian government. So, as I say, whether it's Gaza, Middle East, a lot of this is interwoven. It's interwoven to a larger U.S. foreign policy view of the world and to our competition with China. The heart of our competition with China is technology. That really is the basis. There's a sense that China is moving ahead of us in some very key technologies, all of which have military implications. Just as one example, quantum. It's already 2.5 years ago that China launched a quantum satellite and pulled off quantum communications between Vienna and Tianjin. We have not done this. And now they're announcing that within the BRICS, China and Russia, already this fall, are going to look at some kind of quantum communication links. This is the kind of advance in China that just drives Washington berserk, frankly, and it's what has led to trying to crack down on Chinese semiconductors and various aspects of their economy. A very important speech was given by Jake Sullivan. By the way, Jake Sullivan is from Minnesota. He grew up in Minneapolis, went to high school there. Anyway, he gave a very important speech last April about this and laying out our policy. His basic point was this: you cannot expect the private sector to understand the security implications of its economic activity. In other words, a lot of our tech companies will use their profits for dividends, stock buybacks, rather than reinvesting in technology. So the basic point is the U.S. government has to take this out of their hands to some extent. We have to have a national industrial policy on these key technologies. Now, there's a lot of pushback. I mean, this is obviously, for free marketeers, this is not exactly music to their ears. And The Economist has been very upset ever since this was announced. I mean, I don't know how many different ways you can say you're moving away from the free markets. In fact, The Economist would even say this is becoming like the 1930s, in the sense of the world economy falling apart in the 1930s. It's true. I mean, we have announced a lot of subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act, paying companies to relocate to the U.S., paying European companies to relocate to the U.S. Germany is actually quite upset about this, as they see some of their big companies following the money over to the U.S. Over 100 countries, representing 90% of the global economy, have started subsidies. So there's the danger of a subsidy war that's resulting. Obviously, China was the first to do this, subsidizing their industries. So how's China reacting to this? Well, they're developing relations with Hungary. They're coming in to parts of Europe. They're building a new high-speed railway between Belgrade and Budapest, very high-profile thing. But more to the point, they're focusing now on their trade outside the West, and especially within the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a very, very developed trade partnership, which includes a lot of our allies, Japan and others, and which is now the largest trading bloc in the world. This is where China is starting to focus. They are, just like we are de-risking, they are also pulling back to some extent. Last year, China traded 36% with the developing world, only 33% with the US, Europe, and Japan. So already that shift is taking place once again, the global south. And in 2019, they traded more with Southeast Asia than they did with the US. So these are significant shifts, and the IMF has done a number of studies pointing out that what's going on is highly inflationary. In fact, they label de-risking or decoupling, they call it reshuffling. Because what's actually happening is the United States is shifting to trade, say, with Vietnam or Mexico, but coming in through the back door are Chinese companies, which come in, buy, invest, and actually we're still buying from China. It's just that now there's a Vietnamese middle person. Once again, highly inflationary, and that is an issue for the electorate. So just to finish up now, there's been some positive steps. Biden and Xi met in San Francisco at the at APEC. A couple of gestures were adopted, not real breakthroughs, but for example, China is going to help more with fentanyl. Fentanyl is a terrible problem in the US. 103,000 people died of fentanyl overdose 2 years ago, and I think last year it's much higher. All the components come from China. So there are things like that we really have to talk about. Final point. And by the way, even though things are going better with the U.S., at their last summit, when Putin went to Beijing, the two countries talked about dual containment, that the United States is trying to pursue dual containment of the two. Obviously, NATO is a huge big part of that. And U.S. relations with Europe are a big part of this larger policy, sort of more global policy. So final point though, people talked about how sustainability has fallen down. Among young people in the US, that's not the case. I mean, when I look at my students and things, there's frankly not a lot of understanding or interest in geopolitics. They see that as something more for the boomer generation. They're interested in climate. They're interested in these kind of issues. And they get their information from different sources. So I think, and also on Gaza. So this could be a factor in our election. There's a generation gap that's developing. And whether young voters stay home or whether they vote for someone like RFK Jr., which their indications may happen, this could be a wild card in the US election, third-party candidates. And as I said, I think this generational difference, the new generation in America is much more diverse. And in some ways, I'm finding some of their views parallel those of the North and South. There's a lot of talk about white settler colonialism, right, on US campuses, for example. And so, yeah, it's hard to know where all this will develop. But anyway, I just wanted to outline a few of these larger trends that I think are going to impact the future of US-European relations, but also our elections. So thank you very much.